there's a sense in which I would argue that open access is inevitable, and the three enablers are the technology, and like so many things, the technology is not really the issue. The technology is there and can be used and was developed to do the sorts of things that we started to do at least 10 years ago. There's the economic imperative, which I've just touched on. I want to say one more thing about that. In large research institutions, you get an issue which is described by one of my colleagues at Harvard University, which has developed a mandate in the last 2 years, as the issue of moral hazard, which in an economist's world means that those for whom the consumption of a particular good or service is most important are separated from, and in often cases do not understand or know what its cost is. And that's a classic description of what happens in large research institutions. But the third, and I think by far the most important element of what is happening and what must happen is researcher motivation. If I do some work and I want to be recognised for that work, I want it to be as visible as possible. I want to understand how widely it's been received. I particularly like it if the formal indices of the success and impact of that piece of research, such as citation counts and so on, would reinforce that. And of course, at the moment in many countries, formal assessment of research through a number of instruments is very much to the fore. So what we did at QUT, well, the first thing that I did, innocently, was think that the main changes would occur in the Northern Hemisphere. But for a number of reasons, I gave up on waiting on that and started to talk to the chairs of our faculty research committees about the concept of greater visibility in an institutional repository, and found that there was, in some cases, it was greeted with a kind of a so what response. I already do this with my own articles on my own server. But the issue as a policy and a declaration about what the university would be trying to do went through our University Research Committee, of which I'm a member, in late 2003, and was there subsequently endorsed by the University Academic Board, which, for example, at the University of Pretoria would be what you call the Senate, and that happened so that it became enacted in 2004. I don't expect you to read that, but that's just what the formal university policy looks like in the policy environment as written down by the university. More importantly, this is what it said. So it was very clear that it was to be the quality material. And in fact, what the policy says is this is what must be there. It must be the refereed research literature. What may be there is a string of other more second rank, and I don't mean that in any unkind way to those who have lots of outputs of this form, including myself in the past, but it's not the refereed research literature, but it's some of the other things that we might like to see. And incidentally, can I say that in a university which has a fairly vibrant creative industries faculty, the issue of what a research output or outlet for that is can be quite an interesting media-rich kind of product or thing. The other thing I want to make very clear is there's no conflict here with material that might be commercialised or might be the subject of a legal commitment which says we're not going to make it available. Of course those things need to be observed. And I have to say, and I'd welcome any comment on this later if there's another view, I have to say that I've always been very clear that the material which should be made more available through open access is the material which people want to have exposed because that's part of being a researcher with a reputation. It's not material which I might be seeking to publish for a royalty. It's not material which I would seek to get some personal financial return for. And if it is that kind of thing, it's not involved in this discussion. Now that sometimes gets you into some interesting discussion about the scholarly monograph, but perhaps we can talk about that. And I have also to say that this has occurred during a period of rapidly evolving publisher policies. Quite early on, some of the giant publishers, such as Elsevier, developed a policy for accommodating institutional deposit. Sometimes, however, we can get requests for embargoes, and you can see what the statement is about that at QUT. I'm happy to talk about that as well. The Australian government invested quite heavily in having better advice available to the Australian research community about exactly what can sometimes seem like a maze of difficulty in relation to publisher policies. Remember that I'm talking here about traditional publishing when I say that. So the service was introduced. It was established, as I said, in that time. And one of the most important things that was done very early on was to provide immediate feedback to authors about the extent to which their papers were being downloaded. Now, there's a whole debate about what a download means, but in general, there's quite a high interest by people in the counter that's in operation on the website. And those at the back may not be able to see this, but the first name on that list is Professor Frost. He is a chemist, and he, over a period, has been the most consistently downloaded author. I might say that Professor Frost, at the same time, has experienced significant increase in his citation statistics in the journal literature, that almost everything that appears here has its parallel in an Elsevier journal or whatever other journal has published that work, that if you're within the QT environment and you call up one of his works in this domain, you will be immediately offered the opportunity of linking to the journal form of it, and of course for the purpose of citing, that's often what people will do. One of our most distinguished professors at QUT is Stuart Cunningham. Professor Cunningham was on the research committee when the policy went through, and although he didn't vote against it, he looked very uncertain. 2 years later, there was a week where he was the top author download, and I saw him running across the room to tell his colleague that he'd knocked off Professor Frost that week, and I thought, Professor Cunningham is clear about the value of this in his work. The other thing that happens, and of course you can't control for Google algorithms in any kind of convincing or sustained way, but the other thing that can happen is that a Google search will bring a piece of QUT research to the front page, and this has happened in a number of domains. This is just one example, which actually isn't surprising given the actual string that's been put in, but we have had others. For example, there's been a lot of interest in different countries in the problem of what's called cyberbullying in schools. We have a large education faculty. A search on that topic a few weeks ago would produce 1 million hits. The QUT research was on the first page. And first page or second page presence in a Google search is something that some people would die for. This is the size. I'd like you to note that actually the total number of full text sounds fairly modest, but it has a reasonable correlation with the formally reported research output of the university. Now, while this has been happening over the last 5 years, we've seen the development of policy, and this is the case in Australia with the two main research funding bodies for research, the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council, which make stipulations about the provision of access to these works as a consequence of having received taxpayer money in order to do this research in the first place. We've also seen very early on from the Wellcome Trust, which funds medical research around the world, a very strong view about the accessibility of the research that it funds, such that it required an undertaking by a research grantee about the provision of that kind of access. And I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end. There are many, many institutional mandates there that have developed. Of interest in Australia is that ANU, which was the first ranked university in our recent research rankings, put into effect a policy last year. Now I just want to show you a bit of evidence to back up what I'm saying about research success. So here's Professor Frost, and what you need to look at here is that he's got a steadily growing publication rate over this period, which is from the late 90s onwards. It's 2004 where his material starts to be available and visible on the web. That's what happens to his citations. And he's an addict. So there's nothing he would publish that he wouldn't put into the institutional repository. Here's another one. This time we have what we call an early career researcher. Actually, his interest is in developing water purification processes using solar energy. That's one of his research fields. Extremely topical in my part of the world. And he's had a similar burst in citation rates. A professor of construction economics has a similar picture dating from his early use of the repository. And similarly, someone involved in transport planning. You can see a pattern. Now, we contrast that with this example. So here we have a researcher in epidemiology and sexual health who's got a more uneven representation of their work in the institutional repository. And so the citations per year have grown, but they've pretty much grown at the same rate as their general publication rate. And it doesn't have that sharp curve that we see in those that have put all of their material into the university repository. Now, that anecdotal or accumulating institutional experience at Queensland University of Technology is also matched by some early work on trying to see if there's a correlation between a mandated open access policy in place in a research institution and the citation impact and its relationship especially to high quality research. And that work's been done. I expect more to be done on that in the next few years. I now want to take you through a couple of observations that have been made by some of these researchers about some other things that they've noticed. And one of them is the extent to which people who are in environments which don't have access to the subscription literature, don't have access to the toll-gated journals, will make contact with them about matters of common research concern. So you get that kind of result. There's a second one, and we did ask for our academic staff to make some commentary about this. This is quite a lengthy one. What it actually says is, in a busy life, I have students, and remember many of the students are people who are in the workplace, especially in faculties like business, which this Dr. Luke is from. And there's a dimension of contact with students which is enhanced in this way. We have also, again, connections, in this case, with an Australian rural industry organisation, which then led to some further contract research and research consulting in this particular area. In this case, we're talking about our School of Design. And we have this particular observation from one of our lecturers in urban development, Connie Susilawati, about multilingual publishing and the fact that some of her work is, has resulted in contacts because of work that's available through this avenue.